During the last election season, Oregonians fought one of the most controversial and divisive battles of the state's history over ballot measure 9. The Oregon Citizens Alliance lost that battle, but did not concede the war. They've toned down the wording to make their message seem more palatable, and now dozens of mini measure 9s have proliferated in communities across the state. State Representative Gail Shibley spoke out against Measure 9 as intrusive public policy that would severely tarnish Oregon's reputation. But she also has a personal perspective on the issue. As the first openly gay member of the Oregon Legislature, Shibley has given a great deal of thought to the personal, political, and social impacts of Measure 9, its history, its city and county offshoots, and the new Son of 9 statewide initiative. Representative Shibley recently won re-election last fall to the Portland seat to which she was appointed when Phil Keisling became Secretary of State. A graduate of the University of Oregon, she began her political career as an aide to former U.S. Representative Jim Weaver of Eugene. After several years working for a Portland marketing firm, Shibley returned to public policy as Education and Outreach Manager for the City of Portland's Bureau of Traffic Management, a position she maintains in between legislative sessions. During her tenure as a state representative, Shibley's accomplishments have been recognized by many groups, including the Oregon Women's Political Caucus, Multnomah County Community Action, and the Human Rights Campaign Fund. Please join me in welcoming City Club member and State Representative Gail Shibley to the City Club.
Thank you very much. I also would like to thank Jolene Clausen and Bill Crane for letting me share with you today, and I'm especially appreciative of all the folks on the program committee who I guess couldn't think of anybody else to come speak, so they asked me. Thank you very much. I want to warn you by way of preface also that I'm going to talk about some things that are personal, some things that are political, and you may find some of the terms that I use to be less than comfortable. I use them advisedly, and please bear that in mind for both the audience here as well as through radio and television. The personal is political. That phrase was used time and again during the modern feminist era, signaling that women got it. Women and many men recognized the political realities underlying what they had accepted as everyday reality. Since the 1970s, I've not given much thought to that phrase, a nostalgic relic of an historic era. But it fits. It fits the fight Oregon went through with ballot measure 9 last year. For gay and lesbian Oregonians, though, it fits even better backwards. For us, measure 9 made it quite clear the political is personal. I don't know how many of you have had your humanity up for a popular vote. I don't know how many of you have been the target of a vitriolic campaign of lies. It isn't fun, it isn't validating, it doesn't feel good. How did we ever get here? Oregon has a tragically long history of discrimination, and we are not unique in the country or in the world. Let me share with you some absurdly conflicting stereotypes. I think you'll hear their familiarity. They are clannish. They are loners. They look just like everybody else. They look absolutely different than everybody else. They are communists and anarchists. They are affluent capitalists. They love money. They despise worldly goods. Sound familiar? Likely so. For these and many other stereotypes have been said about lesbians and gays in Oregon and around the world. But that's not whence they come. They are, in fact, a paraphrase of Cornell University's Sandra Gilman's comments in the opening scene of The Longest Hatred, the Oregon Public Broadcasting's recent show on anti-Semitism. I borrow them here for two reasons. First, all discrimination, fear, and ignorance are unique to the targeted minority. The cost is specific. It cannot be quantified or equated. but the dynamics of the scapegoating and the logic behind the phenomenon and the pain it is intended to inflict are the same. Thus, we shed light on one by illuminating another. National gay activist Phil Wilson captured this truth succinctly when he stated, "I've been called nigger, and I've been called faggot, and I know the difference. Nothing." Second, as with religious, cultural, and racial minorities, the stereotypical image of gays and lesbians is a protean one. It shifts. That is precisely what is so convenient about it. It isn't just that gays and lesbians are X. Gays and lesbians are everything you don't want yourself or your family to be. Gays and lesbians are everything that threatens you, your sense of the way things are, and the way things ought to be. Gays and lesbians, as with other groups throughout history, know what it's like to be accursed. We know what it's like to be excluded, what it's like to be unworthy of respect, the other. St. John Chrysostom, at the turn of the century, said of the Jews, quote, "They are the common disgrace and the infection of the whole world." 1,000 years later, the Reverend Lou Sheldon said of gays and lesbians, quote, "They live perverted, twisted lives that feed upon the unsuspecting and the innocent, like our children." Sound familiar? It is the sadly human phenomenon of scapegoating and stereotyping that was played out on Oregon's political stage in 1992. With ballot measure 9, the target was gays and lesbians. Lest we forget, the question was whether or not to amend our Constitution to require discrimination on the basis of one's status, one's sexual orientation. In the midst of this, I was running for office, in the unique position of being both an incumbent and a first-time candidate. As an incumbent, I was the first and only openly gay legislator in our state's history, one of only a few in the history of state legislatures in our country. And because I shared the ballot with Measure 9, the issue of discrimination was often discussed. I felt it important for the voters to know exactly where I stood on the measure and why. In effect, I came out on doorstep after doorstep, night after night, neighborhood after neighborhood, month after month. At times, I was physically frightened. At home, I received harassing phone calls, hate mail, my home was egged, my car vandalized, my lawn signs targeted for theft and destruction. My partner and I ended up sleeping with a crowbar by our bed. Let me read to you one short edited portion from a letter I received during my first term in office. Dear Ms. Lesbo, having just read about your efforts in behalf of the queer community and pending legislation thereof, you may be interested in my bigoted opinions. He then lists several of them, including, I run a major company. It is our policy not to consider any fags or dykes for employment. This will never change despite any legislation you may come up with. I am not homophobic. I have no fear of your type, just contempt. You are a crime against nature. As far as I am concerned, AIDS is the best disease ever to come along. I personally get a lot of pleasure each time some, expletive deleted, faggot dies. Hopefully all will follow. In summation, you never will be more than the slimy pervert that you are now. Forcing a law upon the rest of us will only act to stimulate more people to become active against you. Signed, the Committee to Keep Clackamas County Fag Dyke Free. I must tell you, as a lesbian, I was convinced that the person who typed the letter was a man, as he misspelled the word dyke. The campaign against Measure 9 was enormously costly in terms of money, time, and expertise, precious resources which were necessarily diverted from the many pressing, real problems facing our state. The human toll, however, was even more devastating. Personally, I was utterly fatigued, abjectly exhausted. I felt as though I'd run 6 marathons in 2 months, moving in a daze. In a true manifestation of community, however, I soon learned I was far from alone. Gays and lesbians met in formal and informal support groups, meetings, and discussions. Some took on the added role of emotional counselor, helping others they knew from professional associations, social relationships, and so on. The political became intensely personal. In many respects, we were the walking wounded. We made it through. We made it through, and we will never be the same. After such a long, expensive, offensive campaign, is it any wonder if skins are thin, emotions run high, feelings are on the surface, anger sometimes only too ready to flash? Last January, for instance, though the election was successfully over, I learned I was far from recovered. In a legislative caucus meeting, discussion understandably turned to Measure 9, the OCA, and political lessons learned. I could literally not stomach such dispassionate discourse about a subject suddenly so personal. I had to leave the room. To this day, I have not yet learned how to distance my life, my family's life, my friends' lives from the harsh political reality we faced in 1992 and continue to face today. I hope I never do. One of the shifting stereotypes we often faced was and is, how can gays and lesbians be oppressed when there are so many of them in high places? In reply, I'm reminded of 1930s Austria, when Jews there included noted poets and playwrights and physicians and jurists, psychoanalysts like Sigmund Freud, and composers like Schoenberg and Mahler. But even as they prospered in their individual professions, European anti-Semitism was rampant. The rest is history. Thus, I believe the question is not how can there be oppression when there are so many in high places, but rather how can strides be made in the face of such oppression? The remarkable thing is there have been strides. Today, in national politics, there are numerous gays and lesbians in high-ranking administration positions, including Assistant Secretary of HUD, Deputy Assistant Secretary of HHS, General Counsel of HHS, Assistant Secretary of Commerce, Commissioner of Patents and Trademarks, Deputy Chief of Staff, Counselor to the Secretary of Energy, Associate Director of Personnel at the White House, Special Assistant to the President, Deputy Staff Secretary to the President in the West Wing of the White House. Impressive. Here in Oregon, in Portland, we're also making strides. Despite, or perhaps because of Measure 9, I won a 3-to-1 victory in my contested election, and in fact was a close second to receiving the most votes of any House candidate in the entire state, including those with no opponents. Further, I am privileged to represent a legislative district in which 85% of the voters said no to Measure 9. And now I'm not alone. Oregon again made history last week when our legislature included in its members the first openly gay man, Portland Attorney George Amy. And in a double-edged sword of progress and pain, a 1989 law requires law enforcement personnel to track crimes perpetrated that are based on one's real or perceived sexual orientation. Enactment of that law was progress. The pain comes with the resultant knowledge that that category of hate crime is increasing at 2, 3, and 4 times the rate of crimes based upon other factors. During my time in Salem, fellow legislators have told me privately about gay family members or close friends they have. They have shared the pain they witness as their loved ones suffer humiliation and degradation. Legislative and committee staff furtively seek me out to thank me for speaking out on behalf of equal rights for gays and lesbians. 2 particularly poignant moments came shortly after testifying for a bill codifying equal protection for gays and lesbians, in 1991 and again in 1993. Various staffers sought me out each time with appreciative glances and words, vicariously grateful for having the courage to go public. I look forward to the day when employees at the Capitol and around the state are not afraid to be who they are. I look forward to the day when they are valued for their professional contribution to their workplace. That will not happen until Oregon guarantees basic protection from discrimination for all its citizens, including gays and lesbians. Such legislation has been introduced in the Oregon Legislature every session for the past 20 years. Still, there is no statewide protection from discrimination of gays and lesbians in housing, employment, or public accommodations. Meanwhile, the OCA is not relenting in its attack on law-abiding Oregonians. The OCA's Lon Mabon was in Salem recently, not to testify about the need to finance schools or encourage economic development or increase worker training or reduce child poverty, or offering creative solutions to these very urgent problems. No, Lon Mabon was in Salem recently to grab more headlines for himself and introduce what some call the Spawn of Nine. The sanitized version of Measure 9 may attempt to be, in marketing parlance, new and improved. It may even be presented in some bright new box. But don't be fooled. It is the same old, very old stuff. Here we go again. The front lines in this latest battle of the war against discrimination and injustice are drawn in the OCA's county and city ordinances on the ballot this year. It is there that the OCA hopes to keep building its mailing list, building its bank account, and building on the lies told for so many years. To beat the OCA at the local and state level, we must redouble our efforts to educate, for ignorance breeds fear, fear breeds distrust, distrust breeds resentment, resentment breeds hatred, hatred breeds discrimination and violence. We must also fight two related enemies, apathy and complacency. Apathy results when people don't believe they need to get involved, when they don't perceive a threat as real, when they don't understand the connection between events happening outside their lives and events happening within their lives. Apathy results when people don't believe they make a difference if they do get involved. Both are deadly to our democracy. Both are deadly to our rights and responsibilities as citizens. The personal is political, and the political is personal. With Measure 9, with the 7 local ordinances, with 1994's promised Spawn of 9, the target is lesbian and gay Oregonians. But it's so much more than that. The reality is, the target is each and every one of us, regardless of one's sexual orientation, regardless of one's gender, regardless of one's race, regardless of one's class, regardless of one's partisan label. As Hanan Ashrami has stated, once you strip others of their humanity, you yourself lose a significant portion of your own humanity. The political is very personal. Here we go again.
Thank you very much for traveling the distance physically and emotionally to speak to us today. To prime the pump of questions, we'll first have Susan Stone and then Sandy Marin, and then open the floor to City Club members.
What's it going to take to get legislation passed in Salem that will provide equal protection for all of Oregonian citizens?
I see we're starting out with the easy questions. I think it's going to take, again, overcoming the complacency and the apathy that I mentioned earlier. It's going to take each and every one of us in this room and everybody we know calling and writing. As we're looking at the votes, it's too close, and unfortunately we have some rather good-hearted but weak-spined individuals who on the one hand say, oh yes, that's no problem, I'll vote for that. And then on the other hand, in private, they say, my God, don't bring that issue up, I don't want to have to vote on that. So we have to give them the courage of our convictions in order for this to become law.
Gail, nationally, the issue of gays and lesbians in the military has been on the news every night. Schwarzkopf just testified that he felt it was ill-advised. My question is, with the number of voters and constituents, for example, in your district, who voted 85% against Measure 9, is there any effort nationally or within Oregon to mobilize these voters to speak in favor of gays and lesbians in the military?
Wow, what a lob. I hope I have all the information. There are several organizations, some organized here in Oregon, as well as some nationally in Washington, D.C. One whose name comes to the top of my head is Campaign for Military Service. And if you want information, see that guy right there, Major Frank Dixon, who was on the front page, I think, of the Living section one Sunday Oregonian, and can provide information about that. But that's exactly what it's going to take.
Stuart Gates, City Club member. Ms. Shibley, is there any evidence to the thought that anyone who would write a letter like that is very afraid of his own sexuality? Has anything been done? These people who are more royalist than the king leave some questions, I think. Is there any evidence that you're aware of that might show that?
Not being a psychologist, I'm not sure quite how to respond to that, but I think it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that there's something going on there. And there's no question, but that sexual orientation is, it's kind of an uncomfortable issue, and especially here in this country, we don't really like talking about that in polite company, and I understand that, I really do. The question then becomes, why does one become so fixated? I mean, this was the nicest letter I could share with you. One becomes so fixated about certain bodily functions and how and why and where and when and how much. It's amazing to me that they have so much time to focus on that when, we heard testimony this morning about the economic forecast in the state. It seems like one is definitely more important and more pressing than the other.
B.J. Seymour, City Club member. You referred in your presentation to the enormous amount of resources poured into the campaign on Measure 9, and there have certainly been enormous amounts of resources election after election poured into campaigns dealing with other controversial issues, including abortion and land use and so on. Do you think that the initiative law in Oregon should be changed to make things more difficult so that you don't have to go through this election after election?
Well, that's a very important question, and I'm very proud of the fact that I'm a native Oregonian. I'm very proud of the fact that Oregon has been a pioneer in lots of things, including being the first, and some would say the most liberal state in the country to allow for initiative and referendum. I think the question is not one of where is the difficulty threshold, but rather where is the fairness threshold, and where do the voters, who we all are, the bosses in this experiment called democracy, where can we provide the most informed judgment on a variety of issues? I would hesitate to amend our Constitution to change the initiative and referendum process in response or reaction to any specific issue. As strongly as I feel about protecting the environment, as strongly as I feel about protecting access to safe legal abortion or ensuring protection for gays and lesbians and a variety of other things, I think that we need to be take a little more higher plane than that and not just react to that. There are some proposals that have been discussed that I think meet those thresholds that I talked about. One is actually introduced by Representative Jim Whitty from down on the South Coast that would require 20% of the signatures gathered statewide to come from each of the 5 congressional districts, so that you can't just go out and camp for a couple weekends at a particular urban shopping mall and gather sufficient numbers to put something on the ballot to change the Constitution. His initiative, or his resolution, by the way, only deals with constitutional changes, not statutory changes. I think that makes a lot of sense. We need to hear from people all over the state about whether or not we're going to change our Constitution, not just about somebody who happens to walk into a particular shopping mall on a particular Saturday or Sunday. There's another one that has been introduced by the American Civil Liberties Union that I also think makes some sense, and that is, as if I understand it and remember it correctly, that anything that changes the so-called Oregon Bill of Rights requires at least a 60% yes vote. And perhaps a combination of those two would help ensure that we don't, and I'm talking about us now, that we don't simply react to things on an issue-by-issue basis. I don't think that that's bodes well for our democracy or our society.
Tom Naughton, City Club member. Many people feel that their anti-homosexuality stance seems to be partly backed by religion, Christianity in particular. Could you make a few comments about that?
Well, I've had several discussions with, in fact, several of my colleagues who are very devout in the Christian faith and who try to talk with me about a variety of things, and in so doing use phrases like those steeped in the homosexual lifestyle and very heavy into the homosexual lifestyle. And of course, when I try to counter, I say, well, does that mean that you're very heavy into the heterosexual lifestyle? And he's saying, well, but I find that offensive. And I said, well, what if I found your wedding ring offensive? I mean, there are all kinds of manifestations that become just part of who we are that we don't really think about. And then the talk often becomes about, well, what Christians believe, and well, what we Christians believe. And I said, well, excuse me, you have to find another term to use, because I am also Christian. I take my faith, my beliefs very, very personally. And for somehow there to be a wall to say, if you are this, then you cannot be that, I don't think that does justice to the intricacies of human existence. And I try to bring out the fact, ask them a question, would it make any difference to you, or does it make any difference to you, to look at what Jesus Christ had to say about homosexuality and homosexuals? Nothing. And how much did he have to say about religious hypocrites? A whole lot. Now, I believe, personally, that Jesus Christ knew how much time he had to spend on earth. And he knew the most important messages that he had to get out during his time on earth. And I think he used his time very wisely.
My name is Jim Harrell. I'm a City Club member. I read recently in the Oregonian that, and I don't remember if it was a national poll or a state poll, but there was a poll done indicating that something like 85% of the people surveyed had no moral qualms about oral sex between partners. Does it make sense to try to patch into that changing attitude in order to mobilize the people around the state of Oregon on the issue of homosexual rights? Is that something that we can attempt to utilize in the campaign against the Spawn of Nine?
Well, I appreciate your question. I appreciate your interest in trying to figure out some strategic hook to hang on to. But I firmly believe that the question is whether or not we ought to discriminate on the basis of one's status, not on one's specific behavior, because we all have various behaviors. And heavens, if we started protecting one behavior over another, we do that now in the criminal statutes in Oregon and nationally. But trying to codify acceptance of certain sexual behavior as okay and certain sexual behavior as not okay, I think the question getting back to gays and lesbians is one of status. The reality is, if I never had sexual relations again in my life, I'd be very cranky, but I'd still be a lesbian. And I bet the same would be true of people who are married. I mean, just because, in fact, there are lots of people who are married who don't have sex anymore. So does that make them any less a heterosexual or any less the appropriate target for protection under our laws, under our Constitution? I don't think so. So rather than focus on a specific behavior, I would rather us focus on whether or not you and you and you and you and I all deserve the same rights, no more and no less.
I'll ask a question, but meantime, if there are people who want to ask written questions and give them to staff, you can send them up to the front, and I see Alan happily coming up. What I'd like to know is perhaps broadening your topic to the legislature, which we drew you out of today to come. Do you have any hope that there'll be any comprehensive tax reform measure referred to the voters this in 1993?
If I have anything to say about it, you bet. I've been personally working a lot over the past several weeks now with a variety of other colleagues in the House and the Senate, as well as representatives from the executive branch on just that. And I happen to belong to a minority party in the House of Representatives, and all revenue measures by our Constitution must originate in the House of Representatives. So I am more than a little constrained as far as the easy avenues for expression of my political values. But it would appear as though, and this and $1.50 will buy you a latte, but it would appear as though there will be something. What that thing is, I don't know. I am going to do everything I can to ensure that it provides a long-term framework for financing schools and health care in Oregon.
Hi, Alan Oliver, City Club member. I'm not quite sure how to formulate this, so I'll bounce off an article that I read in the newspaper. The accounting of the situation with the son of the colonel, the 24-year-old student who came out as in reference to the gays and military issue, and a representative of ACT UP was quoted as saying that this guy is no use to us. And I found that disturbing. And I'm wondering just in general about the limitations of status politics, whether those who are focused quite narrowly in terms of sexual orientation or ethnic representation or other kinds of minority issues, whether this is going to achieve goals of justice for all that I think is part of what we're looking for.
I'm sorry, let me back up. I know that ended with a question mark. I'm just not sure I'm tracking very well. The issue really centers or comes from the example of, I think it was Scott Peck and right. Somebody.
What I'm saying is that it seems to me that if this representative of ACT UP is truly looking for a way to achieve a just society for homosexual persons, then he will find a means of fitting this individual into that scheme and seeing that that's also a courageous and important thing that this kid has done, and that there are people who are so narrowly focused on these status kind of questions that it's difficult to get into some of the larger issues. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, I do, and you touch on, I think, a manifestation of a very important difference between the so-called religious right and progressives, if you will, who are concerned civil libertarians, because those on the religious right kind of accede very quickly to a rather hierarchical organization. And they are basically, they are told, or the issues are framed in such a way, the materials are produced, and they have their marching orders, and they go out. And we, God love us all, we are such independent thinkers that we all have kind of different priorities and different perspectives and different ways that we're going to work. And that, I think, is the difference between an organization and a movement. And one is truly grassroots, bottom up, and the other tends to be much more hierarchical, top down. Let me say, I'm certainly not in any position to judge the political effectiveness or social policy behind ACT UP or any representative of that organization. But let me just say, far be it from me to be the most radical person in the gay and lesbian movement. I don't speak for really anyone other than myself. I don't pretend to speak for gays and lesbians as a community. That's like if you are straight, for you to speak for everybody who is heterosexual in America. That's impossible to do. So there are always going to be people everywhere on the spectrum in any kind of movement. And I'm very glad for those people, frankly, because without knowing the specifics of this particular ACT UP representative, ACT UP happens to be, as an organization, somebody who I think helps define the boundaries so that I can look respectable.
Thanks.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. Gail, I wonder if you would care to share with us your thoughts on the question of funding and money in campaigns. It seems that quite often in all kinds of campaigns, the arguments, the validity of the argument, the truth of the arguments end up being swayed through the media and the effort and the spending of money from sources various, one way or the other. So that the truth, the voter, ends up being swayed and confused. What do you think about the whole issue?
Well, let's see. I think a lot of things. I think, one, we need to have public financing of elections. That's not a politically popular thing to say. I will grant that. However, the fact is we pay for it one way or the other. If you don't think we're paying for those rules committee hearings and those ethics committee hearings back in Washington, D.C., I got something to tell you. So one way or another, we are paying for elections now. The question is whether or not that base ought to be broad enough so that everybody pays a little bit, or if you want to give that responsibility and the concomitant rights that go with it to a few targeted people to give $10,000, $20,000, $50,000 or more in a specific race, whether it's for a candidate or an issue. And of course, I'm a very firm believer in broad-based political activity, and to that end, I think that may be a piece of it. Here in Oregon, and actually around the country, organizations like the League of Women Voters and others, I think, have done a very credible job of attempting to inform voters. I think government has a very important job that it has done a very poor job at recently, and that is explaining to people why this is important. If you don't think, for example, the economic forecast is important, then maybe we need to find out, we need to talk about that. But I think that voters need to be engaged in the process rather than disengaged. Former State Representative Beverly Stein also has a suggestion which I like very much, and that is to, for each candidate or political committee to take a portion of its contributions and put it into a fund to provide for specific voter education. And I think on the whole, Oregon already does a better job of that than other states. We've got a long way to go, but let's build on the successes and on our reputation for really, on the whole, running a pretty clean campaign.
My name is Father Jim Galuzzo, City Club member, and I'd like to ask your wisdom on, it seems like being from Hillsborough and Cornelius area, we're struggling right now, I see the OCA members really using political organizing skills, and I saw at an OCA meeting of the ministers, many of them having Saul Alinsky handbooks for organizing. And they can have a meeting together and they can have 600 or 700 people go door to door in Cornelius, with they hope to win 500 votes and win the election. And, you know, here's the side of us fighting against it, who gets 5 people out there? We created these great community organizing skills, and it seems like we're failing to use them, or seems like we're not able to get together, and the emotions are preventing us from getting out there. We only need 500 votes. I mean, if everyone in this room got up, we could talk to 3 people and change this election. But we're getting no one. Sometimes there's 2 of us going door to door. So, I mean, what do we need to do to bring people out there to educate in a community organizing way?
Well, first of all, I'm not willing to concede defeat in Cornelius or any of the local initiatives. I think that they are very, very much up for decision. And it would be extremely premature to declare defeat. But you're absolutely right. The phenomenon is that a lot of so-called progressives have built up these great organizing tools, and now we see them being used against us. And I think that there's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong is, again, the complacency and the apathy that I mentioned earlier. And I don't know how else to do it except continuing to speak out, continuing to try to make the connection to people real. The fact is that a lot of people think they don't know gays and lesbians, and if they do, maybe they think it really doesn't affect them, and even if they do, it's still another step to get them to act in any politically organized way. And so we need to start somewhere. The fact is, though, as I said before, the issue is not just gays and lesbians. The issue is discrimination. And if people don't feel strongly enough about that, if they'd rather sit on their Barca loungers and, channel surf, then maybe we need to deal with that. We need to make this real to them in a way that we're not doing right now.
Linda D'Onofrio, City Club member. Lon Mabon said, and I have also heard people say, that if Measure 9 had been written differently, they would have voted for it. Now that that is a reality, how are you as a lesbian and as a legislature going to deal with this?
Well, I think, they can call it anything they like. But I think this latest initiative that they've dreamed up is, among other things, called the Child Protection Act. Well, I have to tell you, I serve on the Children and Families Committee in the Oregon House of Representatives. During the interim, I served on the Children's Care Task Force. Never once did I see Lon Mabon there. Never once did I see Scott Lively there. Never once did I see any representative of the OCA there. So if they really care about kids, if they really care about protecting and building our families, if they really care about building up communities for the future, then why aren't they ever involved with that?
Alan Hunt, City Club member and member of the Board of Governors. I'd like to thank you first for speaking out on these issues. Also, I've heard you speak in committee hearings, and you're willing to talk about sexuality, contraceptive, the things that are happening to young women. And I see some of the Republican men just wince when you say those things. But for the young people who go to those hearings and to hear you speak sensitively, honestly, and openly, that is so much of an education. And that's what my question is about. Say a little something about what role education of our young people ought to play in this whole issue of tolerance and understanding of all people.
Thank you, Ellen. I appreciate your comments. There's somebody who has been to the Children and Families Committee. I tell you, if you are not an advocate for good, solid public education for any other reason, this ought to persuade you. And the issue is not whether or not to open empty young minds and fill them with all kinds of propaganda. The question is whether or not we want our young people, whether or not you have children individually. The fact is, this next generation and the generation to follow will indeed be our leaders in our old age. So the question really is whether or not we want those young people to be independent thinkers, to think critically and logically and understand connections between seemingly disparate issues. That's the issue. And I would say that a good, solid education ought to be, and that's why I mentioned it first in terms of how we fight this. We need to educate. We need to educate our children, and we also need to educate others throughout the span of life. I think that there is, it's untrue, the old adage, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. My father is about to be 73 years old, and he's come an amazingly long way for living in Albany.
Representative Shibley, I'm Charlotte Kreitzberg from Salem, Portland City Club member. I heard you say a few moments ago that lots of people say they don't know any gays or lesbians. As a person who does know the gays and lesbians and knows that we are working together toward this thing, not just the OCA, is there any way that we can become more acquainted or make the atmosphere more comfortable so that we may come together more and more and more and gather the resource to fight this logically?
Well, first of all, some, I suppose, seemingly glib things come to mind, like come to the Gay and Lesbian Pride Parade, come to the rallies that are held, come to National Coming Out Day, come to some things that might seem like, why would I come to this? But it's important, because just as all discrimination is the same, so too we need to be the same as we face it. I wish I had a quick answer for the larger issue you raised, because I think it really has to do with kind of getting out of ourselves and out of our individual communities a little bit and rubbing shoulders in a way that feels comfortable in the workplace and social settings and families and so on. The fact is that everybody knows somebody who's gay or lesbian. Sometimes that person might be yourself. Sometimes, and you don't know it. Sometimes that person may be your family member or a colleague or a member in your church or synagogue and elsewhere. And the more that we can speak out about this issue, the more we provide some safety and some comfort for people to relax and just be themselves. I'm not sure people understand or appreciate how much energy it takes to edit your life. Day after day after day, you get so good at editing stories 2 paragraphs ahead so you never get to the personal pronoun that it drains you. And after you go out into the world, month after month, year after year, there's a piece of you that kind of shrivels as a result. So we need to make people feel comfortable simply to be who they are. And then not only do they gain, but we gain and our community gains.
I'm Mitzi Scott. I'm a City Club member. I just wanted to let those of you know who are suffering from any apathy or complacency that there is a place you can remedy this. It's called Support Our Communities Political Action Committee. We are the organization that is trying to take on the OCA around the state. There's information on the tables. I hope I have not violated any City Club rules by making this announcement, but I would point out that Gail is correctly and admirably abiding by the laws that say when she is a legislator in a legislative session, she cannot do any campaigning. So I'm relieving her of that burden, and I urge you to get more informed about SOCPAC.
I did get one question from the audience, which says, where do you draw the line between a status that should be protected by law from discrimination and actions that should not be part of a civilized society?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I appreciate the person asking it. I think that at least the way I read that question, hear that question, has to do with one's status on the one hand, and the other side is one's actions. And I believe that there are, in fact, there's an entire volume of Oregon revised statutes that penalizes certain actions by individuals toward other people, toward children, elderly, now toward corpses, toward property, toward animals. So I think we can address and need to keep addressing those actions toward others, whether it's property or people or animals, and at the same time ensure that we each have the right to be let alone. Because if we give up that right, we give up that piece of our society, of our country, that has made all the difference for us, and in fact was the greatest experiment of all upon its founding. I don't know how to address it any differently than that, that one is who you are, and the other are the specific actions that you manifest toward other people and toward other people's property. I think the distinction is very clear. I'm not a certified smart person, I'm not a lawyer, but it seems to me that that's a pretty clear distinction.
I think the program today has been very thoughtful, graceful, and even humorous. We appreciate your addressing us today, and we wish you well. Please join me in thanking Representative Gail Shibley.